Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and welcome to another Jane Austen July video. Today I'm going to be talking about the connections between Mansfield Park by Jane Austen and A Lover's Vows by Elizabeth Inchbald. So, if you don't know, within the novel Mansfield Park, some of the characters rehearse an amateur dramatics production of Lover's Vows. And Lover's Vows is a real play from the 18th century. And I have personally found that reading the play Lover's Vows has really enriched my reading experience at Mansfield Park, and I highly recommend reading Lover's Vows. But I thought today it might be interesting to make a video about Lover's Vows and Mansfield Park, why the amateur dramatics production in Mansfield Park is such a big deal within the novel Mansfield Park, why Lover's Vows is such a scandalous play, and all of the connections between Lover's Vows and Mansfield Park as works of art. I'm going to try and stagger the spoilers to make this video as watchable for as many people as possible for as long as possible. So I'm going to start off with talking about sort of how theatre and acting was perceived in general in the late 18th, early 19th century, and then I'm going to talk about the play Lover's Vows, with spoilers for Lover's Vows, and sort of midway spoilers for Mansfield Park up to the point when they're putting on the production. And then towards the end of the video, I will go into full spoilers for Mansfield Park. I should say that Lover's Vows is a relatively short play. If you want to read it and then watch this video, you're very welcome to do so. It will probably only take you a couple of hours, and it is worth a read. I think it's a really interesting play, and especially for someone who likes Austen and Mansfield Park, it will really enrich your reading experience of Mansfield Park. However, saying that, Lover's Vows is also quite a short play that is quite predictable in its plot points. So I wouldn't say that knowing the plot of Lover's Vows before reading it is necessarily going to have a huge impact on your enjoyment of the play. So, you know, how much you mind about spoilers is up to you. I have a lot of notes for this video, so one, it might be very long, but also apologies if I keep looking down at my laptop to actually make sense of everything that I have to say and make sure I don't forget anything. So first off, I want to talk about how theatre and acting, and especially actresses, were perceived at this point in the late 18th, early 19th century when Mansfield Park was written and set, because I think it is very important to your understanding of Mansfield Park to understand that acting was not really considered respectable. It was considered quite risque, really, I suppose, for want of a better word. If you were, in the Georgian period, a respectable member of the upper or middle classes, then you might well go to the theatre and enjoy the theatre, but you wouldn't invite an actor around for dinner. You wouldn't do that because they were not considered respectable people. The association between acting and, let's say, promiscuity, which is probably a kinder word than would have been used at the time, but the association between acting and promiscuity was very embedded at this point in time. Obviously the idea of actors being quite bohemian and sort of living unconventional lives lasts much beyond the 18th and early 19th century, but at this point in time when Jane Austen was writing, there was the feeling that actors, and especially actresses, were not moral people, and were not people who were necessarily living sort of sin-free lives. If you're listening to this video rather than watching it, please do note that I'm using lots of air quotations here. I think there are a number of reasons why within the late 18th and early 19th centuries, acting was associated with sexual promiscuity. It's partly to do with the fact that on a stage, men and women might be physically closer to each other and saying things to each other in a way that wouldn't be socially acceptable in any other circumstance. I think it's also partly to do with the independent lives that actresses sort of naturally led through the nature of their profession. You know, at this point in time, there's very much an idea that women's natural place is in the home, not working. So actresses, as women who are working, are sort of already automatically under scrutiny. And there's also a sort of long-held mistrust around acting and the idea that it is akin to lying. You know, this idea that you couldn't trust someone who is an actor or an actress because they're obviously good at pretense. And I think this is especially key in terms of how women were perceived and actresses were perceived at this point in time, because women are very much meant to be not good at pretending and not good at lying and not good at manipulating and all of that kind of stuff. The ideal woman at this point in time would be someone who wouldn't be good at acting because they would be too pure. Again, using lots of air quotations here. And all of this comes together to mean that for the polite society of the 18th and 19th century, there is an idea that acting is akin to sex work, basically, which sounds extreme, but that was generally the perception. There is an assumption at this point in time that actresses might have relationships outside of marriage, and for the people in the 18th and 19th century, the line between sex outside of marriage and sex that was paid for is very thin. That was not a distinction that was always made at this point in time. Sometimes the word prostitute means a sex worker. Sometimes it just means a woman who's having sex with someone she isn't married to. And the idea that actresses are sexually promiscuous and may or may not be paid for sex, as well as being an actress, that's very much like embedded in social thought at this point in time. The connotation with acting for women is sexual promiscuity. The idea that actresses are like fallen women, that is very widespread throughout the 18th and 19th century. Therefore, if you keep all of that in mind and all of the like cultural baggage attached to acting, and especially women acting at this point in time, I think you will have a better sense of why in Mansfield Park it is considered morally dubious and a bit scandalous for some respectable upper-class young ladies to engage in amateur dramatics. It is basically quite risque. So let's move on to Lovers' Vows specifically. There won't be any spoilers yet, but I will warn you before the spoilers come. Lovers' Vows is the play that the Mansfield Theatricals focus on in Mansfield Park, and it was a real play, as I said, and it was one that was very popular in Jane Austen's lifetime, so I think that Jane Austen probably had an expectation that readers would at least know Lovers' Vows reputation when reading this book at the time. It was first performed in Covent Garden in October 1798, and it ran for 42 performances, which sounds like not a very long run now, but for this point in history was a really long run. Usually they change show much more often than we do now. It also went on to be performed in a lot of other cities around England, so like I say, it was a pretty well-known, successful play in Jane Austen's time. Now, Lovers' Vows is not an original play. It is a translation, perhaps it might be more accurate to call it an adaptation, of a German play by August von Kotzebue. And the literal translation of the German title is The Child of Love, or The Love Child, i.e. the illegitimate child. So you kind of already know from the German title that this is going to be a relatively scandalous play. Interestingly, Elizabeth Inchbald's English title is much less scandalous. I should maybe say, in case you don't know, that I feel like the word lover now has very like sexual connotations, but very much didn't at this point in time. It just had the connotation of someone who's in love with someone. Like, it might as well be called Suitor's Vows. Anyway, Elizabeth Inchbald's version differs from the original German in several ways. She outlines this in her introduction, and you kind of get the impression that it is a relatively loose translation where she has moved things around a little bit and changed some of the dialogue. And I gather that she specifically toned down two characters. One, a young woman called Amelia, who is quite a forward young woman in the English version, but is an even more forward young woman in the German version. And she also toned down Count Cassel to make him a bit of a less scandalous character. Lovers' Vows as a play is fairly over the top in some ways. It's a bit melodramatic, but I personally really like it. It's fun, it's subversive, it's clever, has a lot of interesting elements and themes. Before I go into spoiler territory, I'm going to quickly go through the sort of main characters of Lovers' Vows, and I'm going to tell you who is playing each character in Mansfield Park. So I guess that's sort of like minor spoilers for Mansfield Park, but it's not a big spoiler really. So the first character we meet in Lovers' Vows is Agatha. Agatha is a fallen woman, as they would have said at the time, who 2 decades ago was seduced by a local nobleman and bore an illegitimate child. The character of Agatha in Lovers' Vows is played by Maria Bertram in Mansfield Park. Next we have Frederick, who is Agatha's illegitimate son, the love child of the German title, and he is played by Henry Crawford in Mansfield Park. Next we have Baron Wildenheim, who is the nobleman who 2 decades ago seduced Agatha. So he is Frederick's father, but he has nothing to do with Frederick. After he abandoned Agatha, he married a noblewoman and had a family with her. This is all backstory. This is not a spoiler for the play. Baron Wildenheim is played in Mansfield Park by Mr. Yates. Then we have Amelia, who is the legitimate daughter of Baron Wildenheim. So she is the daughter of his marriage, Frederick's half-sister, though she doesn't know Frederick exists. And she is played in Mansfield Park by Mary Crawford. Next we have Count Cassel, who is a foolish nobleman who wants to marry Amelia. And he is played by Mr. Rushworth in Mansfield Park. Then we also have Anhalt, who is Amelia's tutor, a clergyman, and he is played by Edmund Bertram in Mansfield Park. And then there are various other smaller parts, including a butler who likes to tell stories in verse, and he is played by Tom Bertram in Mansfield Park. I think you can understand just from the cast list why certain things about the play Lovers' Vows would have been considered scandalous for a group of young upper-class people to perform at this point in time. The fact that within the cast of characters we have a so-called fallen woman, her illegitimate son, and the man who seduced her and abandoned her, that is already very scandalous, and we haven't even got into the plot of the play. So I'm now going to go into a bit more detail about Lovers' Vows and what happens during the play. I'm going to give a plot summary, so there will now be spoilers for Lovers' Vows. So there are 5 acts in Lovers' Vows. In Act 1, we meet soldier Frederick, who has returned home to find his mother, Agatha, sick from poverty and want. He has come home to retrieve his birth certificate. He's a soldier and he needs his birth certificate to sort of get on in the army. And Agatha has to admit to him that he has no birth certificate because he is illegitimate. He's never known this before. And she tells him that 20 years ago, she fell in love with a man from a class far above her own. She's from a working class background. She's a farmer's daughter. And she fell in love with a nobleman who promised to marry her and then ultimately abandoned her, leaving her pregnant with her reputation ruined. And she gave birth to Frederick. And this is what we learn in the first act of the play. In Act 2, we meet the Baron, Baron Wildenhelm, who we know from hearing his name in Act 1 is Frederick's father and Agatha's seducer from 20 years ago. And we also meet the Baron's daughter, Amelia, Frederick's half-sister, though they don't know of each other's existence. They are inhabiting their big grand house, and also as a guest in their house is Count Castle, a man who wants to marry Amelia. But neither Amelia nor her father are really sure whether he's a good match. The Baron is trying to ask Amelia sort of what she thinks of Count Castle, but Amelia is quite sort of witty and vivacious and won't really give him a straight answer. So the Baron asks Amelia's tutor, Anne Holt, to speak to her about marriage and love and trying to get her sense of whether or not she is considering Count Castle seriously. And we get the impression from the way Baron Wildenhelm talks that he deeply regrets his own marriage, which was made for sort of connection, not love, and that he wants Amelia to have a different fate in life. And we get the impression very soon that this is because he truly loves Agatha and he very much regrets leaving her behind. In Act 3, Frederick is increasingly concerned about his mother. They have no money, she's really unwell, and so he goes out into the streets to beg for money, and he stumbles across, by chance, Baron Wildenheim. Of course, not knowing that this man is his father. He's heard his name, but he's never seen him before. And when the Baron won't give Frederick enough money to help his mother, he threatens the Baron, and the Baron has him arrested. After this, we have a scene between Amelia and her tutor, Anne Holt, where he talks to her about marriage, meaning to talk to her about Count Castle, but Amelia, in turn, flirts very hard at Anne Holt and basically outright declares her feelings for him and more or less proposes to him, which, you know, relatively scandalous for this point in time, and he ultimately is forced to admit that he loves her too and that he would like to marry her, but is worried very much that her father would refuse because Anne Holt is not from, you know, the high class that Amelia and her father are from. In Act 4, Amelia goes to visit Frederick in prison, not knowing this is her half-brother, but when she names the man that Frederick attacked, he realises that it is his father, and that Amelia is his sister. Shortly after this, the Baron learns that Count Castle, who he was considering as a suitor for his daughter, is in fact a very dubious moral character who has been philandering and seducing lots of young women, and therefore he decides that Amelia can't possibly marry him. When he talks to Amelia about this, she says that's just as well because she's in love with Anne Holt and she would like to marry him. This scene is interrupted by Anne Holt bringing Frederick to plead his case to the Baron, and when Frederick is let in to see the Baron, he reveals that he is his illegitimate son. And then finally, in the 5th act, we have sort of reunion and marriage for all. The Baron gives his blessing for Amelia and Anne Holt to get married, and the Baron decides that in order to atone for all of the harm that he did Agatha by abandoning her many years ago, he's going to marry her. Agatha doesn't really get asked whether she would like to marry him. That doesn't really come into it in this play, but we're told that the Baron and Agatha are going to get married, therefore elevating Agatha into the upper classes, and Frederick will become the Baron's heir. A happy ending by 18th century standards. So now let's talk about why Lovers' Vows is a scandalous play for the young people of Mansfield to choose to perform. In this section, there will be like sort of midpoint spoilers for Mansfield Park. I'm going to talk about what's happened to Mansfield Park like up to and during the theatricals, but not really beyond, if that's useful to know. So the character of Maria Bertram within Mansfield Park is a young woman who is engaged to be married to a man called Mr. Rushworth, and she is playing Agatha. So she is playing a so-called fallen woman with an illegitimate child. This in itself is pretty scandalous for a young lady from an upper class family who is sort of I guess 20, 21 years old to be playing that kind of character is already very scandalous. And Mariah is taking on the role of exactly the kind of woman she is not meant to be and that she is meant to be the furthest from. And while Mariah Bertram is playing Agatha, Henry Crawford is playing Frederick, Agatha's son. So up to this point in Mansfield Park, Mariah is, as I said, engaged to Mr. Rushworth, but she has been carrying on a flirtation with Henry Crawford. It's clear that Mariah likes Henry Crawford. He's been flirting a lot with her. There's been lots of flirtatious commentary between them. And it's difficult to know at this point in the novel how serious Henry Crawford's feelings are towards Mariah, and also how seriously Mariah is considering him in relation to her present engagement to Mr. Rushworth, who is a very wealthy man. And we know from very early on in Mansfield Park that Mariah is marrying Mr. Rushworth sort of solely for his money and property. She doesn't really find him a very interesting person, and nor indeed does anyone in Mansfield Park. Poor Mr. Rushworth. Anyway, I think it's really interesting that within the Mansfield Theatricals, Henry Crawford is playing Frederick, Agatha's son, and Mariah Bertram is playing Agatha. So the two characters outside of the play are carrying on a flirtation, and in the play they are playing mother and son. Now this is very interesting. I feel like when I first read Mansfield Park, before I had read Lovers' Vows, I very much assumed that Henry Crawford and Mariah were playing lovers in the play and that was part of what was scandalous. But actually no, they're playing mother and son. But because they're playing mother and son, because they're playing family, they actually have a lot more like touching to do on stage. If you read the script of Lovers' Vows, there is a lot of embracing between Frederick and Agatha. They also have quite a lot of scenes that are just the two of them. And all of this means that during the rehearsals for Lovers' Vows, Mariah has a lot of excuses to be alone with and to touch a man who is not the man she is engaged to. Then we also have the character of Amelia, who is played by Mary Crawford. Amelia in Lovers' Vows is a very forward young woman who more or less proposes to Anne Holt, her tutor, which is, you know, breaking all of the gender conventions of the time, but it's also breaking all of the class conventions of the time because she is a noblewoman and Anne Holt is her tutor and a poor clergyman. He is not of the same class as her. As I said, Amelia is very outspoken and very forward for this point in time. She confesses her feelings to Anne Holt and more or less proposes to him. Apparently in the original German version, she kisses him on stage. That is cut from Elizabeth Inchbald's version. She obviously considered that too scandalous for the English stage, but we very much have Amelia courting Anne Holt, not Anne Holt courting Amelia, which is deeply subversive for this point in time. That is another very scandalous element of this play. And then also within Lovers' Vows, we have two, for want of a better word, fallen men. We have both the Baron and Count Castle, who both have like scandalous sexual histories. Baron Wildenhain had a sexual relationship with Agatha when they weren't married, and ended up abandoning her when she was pregnant. And although he now repents that and ends the novel by marrying Agatha, he still would not be considered a paragon of sexual morality. And then we have Count Castle, who has a history of seducing women and doesn't seem to feel guilty about that at all. Both Count Castle and Baron Wildenheim continue to be respected in society, while Agatha has been ostracised, which is partly about gender, of course, them both being men, but also partly about class, because they're both from the nobility. But despite that, they are still two quite scandalous characters for upper-class young people to be representing on stage. Moreover, Lovers' Vows is very much a play that draws attention to double standards in matters of sexual morality, and is in many ways a play about like the effects of sexual relationships outside of marriage and the damage they can have on women and their illegitimate children, and that in itself is all like a hugely scandalous thing to be discussed and portrayed in the billiard room of a country house. It is a play that is really examining the double standards that men and women are held to around sexual morality at this point in time, and that is quite scandalous and quite subversive. This play is all about themes and subject matters that were not meant to be openly discussed amongst the upper classes, certainly not in mixed company, certainly not by unmarried young women at this point in time. And then another big reason why this play is scandalous is that Agatha gets a happy ending. Putting happy ending in air quotations there because, as I said, how happy do we really find Agatha's ending as a modern reader? No one really asks her whether she wants to get married to the Baron Wildenheim. He does ask if she forgives him and she says yes, but that's about like all we get. He did kind of ruin her life. Like, is she really happy to get married to him? But anyway, regardless of how we see that as a modern reader, by 18th century standards, Agatha gets a happy ending. Agatha, a woman who had sex outside of marriage and has had an illegitimate child, doesn't doesn't end up dead, as so many such women do in 18th and 19th century literature. No, she ends up married to the man who abandoned her, and by marrying the Baron, she ends up elevated to the nobility, and her illegitimate son gets made heir. This is all very, very subversive for this point in time. People of the late 18th and early 19th centuries would probably, I think, have thought that Lovers' Vows was kind of a play encouraging sin. Air quotations there. This is all very subversive for this point in time, both in terms of gender politics and also like class politics. And I think that is one of the reasons why Lovers' Vows is really interesting. But also you can understand why it is quite a scandalous play for young upper class people, and especially young upper class unmarried women who are meant to be, you know, very, very respectable and pure and innocent and ignorant of all things. You can understand why this is a scandalous play for them to be putting on. Finally, I want to talk about some of the like plot and character parallels between Lovers' Vows and Mansfield Park, because there are quite a lot. So now we're going to go into full spoilers for Mansfield Park. Please don't watch the rest of this video unless you have read Mansfield Park or know the story. And I would say that Mansfield Park is not that predictable a novel, and it's not as predictable a plot as Lovers' Vows. So I would recommend that you read Mansfield Park before listening to the rest of this video. There are a lot of really interesting parallels between Lovers' Vows and Mansfield Park, I think, that go beyond the moment in which the play is performed. So let's start off with Mr. Rushworth and Count Cassel. Count Cassel is the man that Mr. Rushworth is playing. Both Count Cassel and Mr. Rushworth are foolish young men of great fortune, who aren't very clever and are trying to marry the daughter of the house, as it were. In Mansfield Park, Mr. Rushworth is trying to marry Maria Bertram. In Lovers' Vows, Count Cassel is trying to marry Amelia. And both Count Cassel and Mr. Rushworth are trying to marry a young woman who is more romantically interested in someone else. So Amelia doesn't like Count Cassel, she actually wants to marry Anne Holt, and Maria Bertram is engaged to Mr. Rushworth, but carrying on a flirtation with Henry Crawford. So there are quite a lot of similarities between Mr. Rushworth's situation and the situation of Count Cassel, who he is playing in the play. There are, however, quite big differences between their personalities. You know, we never get a sense that Mr. Rushworth is a sort of bad, immoral person like Count Cassel is. Mr. Rushworth seems to have a good heart. He's just not as clever as the people around him. One thing that I find really interesting in comparing the two situations here is that both Sir Thomas, Maria Bertram's father, and Baron Wildenheim, Amelia's father, feel divided on whether to promote the match between their daughter and her suitor because it's a good match financially and sort of on paper, if you will, but they both wonder, you know, can their daughter really love and respect this man? Amelia, in Lovers' Vows, refuses to even consider Count Cassel. She definitely doesn't want to marry him. But Maria doesn't refuse to consider Mr. Rushworth. She engages herself to him. And although afterwards, when she meets Henry Crawford, she does consider breaking off her engagement with Mr. Rushworth if Henry Crawford proposes to her, when he doesn't propose to her and when he leaves Mansfield, rejecting her by default, she decides she will go ahead and marry Mr. Rushworth. So I think the parallels there are very, very interesting to look at. And then, of course, we have the parallels between Maria Bertram and Agatha, of which there are many. Maria, in the play Lovers' Vows, is playing a so-called fallen woman on stage, which is what she eventually becomes. Ultimately, she marries Mr. Rushworth and then runs away with Henry Crawford and ends up divorced and disgraced. While Agatha, in Lovers' Vows, eventually marries the Baron and gets wealth and status, Maria is left as an outcast, basically, with her reputation in tatters after she runs away from her marriage. And again, within Mansfield Park, we see Jane Austen examining the double standards around sexual morality at this point in time through the different ways people react to Maria and Henry Crawford's behaviour. I also think that Anne Holt and Amelia are really interesting to look at here in terms of thinking about Mansfield Park. Obviously, in personality, Amelia is very like Miss Crawford, and Anne Holt is a bit like Edmund. We have the forward, witty, independent young woman, and the more sombre clergyman with a strong moral centre. But if you look at their situation rather than their characters, I also think there are a lot of parallels to Edmund and Fanny. The suggestion is, I think, that Amelia has fallen in love first. She certainly expresses it first. And we know that Fanny has fallen in love with Edmund first. She is in love with him for years before he ever thinks of her that way. Anne Holt is Amelia's tutor. He has been teaching teaching her for the past 2 years, and while he has been teaching her, she has fallen in love with him. It is worth saying he's only been teaching her for 2 years, so only since she, at least by 18th century standards, was an adult, so, you know, it could be more inappropriate, I guess. But anyway, there's quite a lot of discussion of teaching and learning between them. I'm going to read one brief section from the play. Anhalt says, "There is nothing to the subject." Amelia: "What is the subject?" Anhalt: "Love." Amelia, going up to him: "Come then, teach it me. Teach it me as you taught me geography, languages, and other important things." Anhalt turns from her. Amelia: "Ah, you won't. You know you have already taught me that, and you won't begin again." Now, within Mansfield Park, we have Edmund and Fanny, and Edmund is Fanny's cousin. He is a few years older than her, and she has looked up to him since she was a child, and she has used Edmund's behaviour as a model for her own behaviour. Austen at one point says that Edmund has formed her mind, and we could have a separate discussion on some of the more problematic aspects of Edmund and Fanny's relationship, but I do think there are parallels there in Edmund and Fanny to Amelia and Anhalt, even though Fanny is sort of like the opposite to Amelia in personality. Another parallel I wanted to draw is about class. Agatha is from a working class background. She says, "My parents were poor but reputable farmers," and she ends up marrying a baron. Yes, it takes 20 years and she spends a long time living in poverty, but ultimately she marries into the upper classes. So like Mansfield Park, we have a sort of Cinderella rags to riches element here. In Lovers' Vows, Agatha, a girl from a working class background, ends up marrying into the upper classes and ultimately living an upper class life, and her illegitimate son too is being brought into the upper classes. Meanwhile, in Mansfield Park, we have Fanny, whose family are sort of lower middle class, maybe middle class, but definitely not upper middle class. They never seem to have much money, and Fanny is sent to live with the Bertrams, who are upper class, landed gentry. Sir Thomas Bertram is a baronet. They are far above Fanny's family in the social scale. While Fanny lives with the Bertrams, she is often treated as lesser than them and scorned, just as we see Agatha scorned by people in Lovers' Vows, but ultimately, Fanny ends up married to Edmund, the son of a baronet, and ends up as a clergyman's wife, which I guess sort of places her like upper middle class, lower upper class. Class is complicated, but both of these stories show us a heroine who has a sort of class and social rise over the course of the play/novel, which I think is really interesting. So I think that's all I wanted to say. I feel like I've been talking for such a long time, but I hope this has been a useful video. I really think that reading Lovers' Vows will enrich your understanding of Mansfield Park, and I think thinking about them alongside each other really enriches both. I find them so fascinating to look at side by side. I love Mansfield Park a lot, as I've said many times before, but I do think reading Lovers' Vows tells you a lot of really interesting things about Mansfield Park and really heightens your appreciation of some of the social criticisms and themes that Jane Austen is looking at in Mansfield Park. I think that's all for today. Do let me know your thoughts down in the comments. If you've read Lovers' Vows, if you spotted any other connections and parallels between Lovers' Vows and Mansfield Park. That's all for now. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.